This class takes us inside the Jewish wine economy of earlier centuries. We will see communities enforcing price ceilings, outlawing seller collusion, and appointing assessors to protect community members from being overcharged. In some places, the system became aggressively strict, with monopoly-style selling rights, blind tastings, barrels sealed by wine assessors, community-owned measuring jugs, and stiff fines for anyone who tried to sell wine off the books. The Maharil, Rabbi Yaakov Alevi Moilin, was one of the great Rabbanim who lived in Germany in the early 1400s, passed away in 1427. And a student of his published a sefer known as Sefer Maharil that is quoted widely in the realm of halacha. And the Sefer Maharil says the following passage. Amar Maharil, again it's a student writing, he heard from his teacher the Maharil, Ma she'noegim b'kehilos. There's a custom among the Jewish communities that when people are leaving shul, they make an announcement. What's the announcement? They let the people know, who is the one who is selling the wine. So people can know where he lives. People can know where he lives if they want to buy wine. So this type of announcement, Lo Yasu came Beleil Shabbos. Don't do this announcement on Friday night. The reason you shouldn't do this announcement on Friday night is imagine you hear an announcement in the shul that says, so-and-so is where you can buy wine. That sounds like commerce on Shabbos. We don't like commerce on Shabbos, therefore this announcement should not be made on Shabbos. To clarify, if a person needs wine on Shabbos, and there's someone who sells wine, and there's no shaila of carrying, are you allowed to go to that person and say, please give me a bottle of wine and we'll deal with it after Shabbos? The answer is yes. There's a Siman in Shulchan Aruch that deals with this. Siman Shin Chav Gimel, it talks about it. There's Pratei Dinim. The bottom line is there's definitely a way how to do it. And even if it's not L'tzaydich Mitzvah for Kiddush, even if you want to just have a drink, fine. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is the announcement to let people know where they can go to get the wine. So that type of announcement in the shul, he feels, looks like mekach or memkar, and therefore this should not be done. Instead, yagid shem ha'ish mi bayis labayis. You should say who the wine seller is, going from house to house, koidim Shabbos, before Shabbos, when kishakoida lava lebeis hakneses, when you're calling the people to come to shul. So in the 1300s and the 1400s, the norm in the Jewish community was, remember, people don't have clocks or watches really at that time. So how do you know when is the right time to come to shul? So they used to have the shamash used to go on the street and would say it's time to go to shul. And so when the shamash is going and making that announcement, that's the right time to say. And by the way, the wine, if you need the wine, this is where you're going to end up buying the wine. This is what the Maharil says, and this is quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. This is Taka the Halacha that's quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the obvious question that arises over here is, why don't we know where we're getting wine? Why is this like a little, we need an announcement in shul? Like, I know who sells wine. Like, I'm living here. I know who sells wine. Why is this an issue? It seems like for some reason we don't really know who's selling wine, and we need some sort of an announcement in order to help us figure that out. So as we move through the material of this shir, this idea is going to become clarified in our minds, as we will see. Behektim. Jewish communities have power, the leadership have power to do a lot. And one of the things that they legislated upon was the idea of price controls. And the Gemara in Baba Basra gives the community leaders the power to set price controls. As it says in Gemara Baba Basra, Daf Ches Amud Beis, that Ashoyim Bnei Oir, Lahasnais Alamidos, the citizens of a city, can make rules about measurements and about prices, sha'arim is prices, val schar poelim, and on wages, ula'asiya al kitzasan, and enforce their regulations with fines. So a community has the right to pass these types of laws. And as a result, throughout history, communities use this to control prices. And in fact, we're going to see right now, relevant for our purposes, is to control the prices of wine. That prices of wine should not go too high. Everyone needs wine. Some people can't afford it if the prices are going to go up. And so therefore, as a result, kihilis mei takonis. Let's see two examples. The first comes from Shal Sechuvas HaRashba Chelek Aleph. Simin Tov Kuf Tzadik. The Rashba lived in Barcelona. He passed away around the year 1310. And here is the question. Sha'alta oid. You had another question. Hakol tiknu. The Jewish community made a takana shelo yimkar odam yayin liyaser mishmoina pshitim hamida. That the wine should not be more than 8. Pshitim is a type of coin. So it should not be more than 8 of this coin. Hamida for the standard bottle or cup or whatever it was that they were purchasing at the time. It should not be more than shmoina pshitim. That is the amount. And if it's inferior wine, in which case that measurement is not worth the 8 coins. So then sheyimkar al pi shnayim berurim yeduim she'amidu ala midos. Then you can't just sell it. You can't just make a sale. There are 2 officers appointed by the community, and you need to come to them and you need to say, I have a little bit of an inferior wine, check out my bottle, tell me how much can I sell a cup for? And they tell you what you could sell, and you're not allowed to go more than that. So you can see over here how the community is regulating the price of wine. And the community wrote this down in a document, and they also included other takanas about wine. The Rashba doesn't tell us what the other takanas were, but this document included other takanas as well, and that's going to be important for the rest of the story. And then at the end of this document, in this unnamed community, it says, and whoever doesn't obey what it says above is going to have to pay a knas of 50 golden coins, and they're going to be in cherem. And in fact, if community members buy from a person who's disobedient and not following the rules, then the people who purchase and drink the wine, they too are going to be violating this cherem. So this is the community not only doing the legislation, but also putting teeth on this legislation. Okay, then what happens is we have an individual from the community, and he starts selling wine, and it's not good enough to be to just say, you can charge no more than 8, because it's not good enough. It's inferior wine. And so the community members, they come and they test the wine and they say, you could charge 7. So he's allowed to charge 7. And what happens is, now the community elected officials say, he sold more than 7. Now what happens over here is there's a factual question in this case. Due to the way he talks about the money, which I wasn't able to understand, is it indeed more than the 7 or not? So he said, no, I was in compliance with the regulation. And they're like, no, the way you did it, you weren't in compliance with the regulation. But so that's a factual question. But in addition to the factual question, the guy also made a legal argument. The individual made a legal argument. What was his argument? He said at the end of the takana, it says that those who violate kol mashanichtav le'il, who go against all that is said above, they're the ones who have to pay the 50, and they're the ones put in cherem. I didn't violate all of the pieces of this legislation. I only perhaps violated one piece of the legislation. That's about the price. And so therefore, I shouldn't have to pay this fine at all. The community says that's ridiculous. You have to think about the intention of the community when they made this legislation. They never thought that they meant to say, they never intended that if you do all 15 Avedas in the document, then you get the 50 coin fine. What they meant was, you go by the intention, what they meant is if you violate any of them. That's what their argument was. So they come to the Rashba with both of these questions. The factual question is a factual question. This legal interpretation of this individual is quite creative. I have to say it's also a little wacky, but that's his argument. His argument is, I didn't violate all of it, so I don't have to pay. The Rashba in his response says, Eini roya mamish b'dvarav. There's no substance to what this person is saying. And what he does, it's really interesting. There's 2 ways you could combat this. One is you could say, don't focus too much on the text of the takana, focus on the intention. And the truth is that this is a big sugya in legal interpretation in all cultures. And that's, how do you deal with a text, and then it's like there's tension between the intention of the legislator versus what the actual text says. So are you more of a textualist? Are you more of so you just focus on what it says, or is it more about the intent? Do you consider legislative intent? Is that something that matters or not? And Adayoim in many different cultures, a big machloikus about this issue. So the community is saying you go by the intent. He's saying you go by the text, by the text of the rule. The Rashba, it seems, answers, afilu l'shitascha, that you want to go by the text, you're wrong. Why is that? So he brings a pasuk in the Torah, the end, I think it's in Parshas Kedoshim, where it says, Al titamu b'chol eila. So there's a whole list of things you're not supposed to do. And then the pasuk says, don't defile yourself by doing chol eila. So what does it mean? It means only if you did all of the arayas, then you violated al titamu b'chol eila. No, what it means is, al titamu b'shum davar me'ela. Don't do any of these things. That's what it means. Al derech zeh lo yisasa chol malacha. It means you shouldn't do all the malachas on Shabbos. No, it means lo yisasa shum malacha. That's what it means. And so therefore he says, even on a textualist level, this guy is wrong. And so therefore, but on the factual question, so that's another story. And again, I don't want to get into that. In fact, the Rashba sided with this individual on the factual question and said that in this case, Hitaka wasn't over on the takana because of the facts of the case. What do you see from here? What you see from here is that somewhere, presumably it was in Spain where the Rashba was, somewhere in that area, you had a community, they're making legislation. For wine, you can't charge more than shmoina pshitim. And if it's inferior wine, then there's going to have to be an ad hoc assessment to give a price gap for that wine. That's the first example. The second example comes from another Spanish Rishon. This is the Rivash. The Rivash is Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheishes, and he starts out in Spain, but due to the persecutions and the terrible persecutions of 1391, he's forced to leave from Valencia, Spain, and moves to North Africa. However, this tshuva is Simin Shin Lamed. Shin Lamed is a continuation of Simin Shin Chav Zayin. Shin Chav Zayin is written to a man named Reb Moshe Binyamin from the Spanish city of Salamanca. So it stands to reason that this tshuva was written by the Rivash while he was still in Spain, though I should point out that the Rivash was like in Valencia, areas that are in today eastern Spain. Aragon is the name of the region, and in other places like that, and Salamanca is all the way in Castile, very, very far away. But for some reason, he's asking him, and that's the and that's the circumstances here. So what's the shaila? Let's read the shaila. Oicha alta. You have another shaila. Yesh takana bekal, the community, presumably in Salamanca, has a takana, shakasuba, it says, shabale ayayin lo yiskapsu lahalis ayayin me'ashar, that the wine merchants are not allowed to gather together and to raise the wine price more than the shar, the current price or the natural price of what the wine is supposed to be. In other words, what you have over here is the concern of, what's it called, price gouging, when a group, what's it called? A cartel. A group comes together and they basically say that we're not going to charge less than a certain amount. So the takana says that we're not going to allow the people who are selling wine to have these meetings and to pass that type of legislation. However, the takana says, individuals, they could choose. If you want to raise your wine, no problem, but you can't be in cahoots with the other people. Now what happened is, so the midah, whatever the standard measurement is, it's either 4 or 5 coins. And if you have inferior wine, it's l'shloisha, it costs 3. So that's the standard, what's going on now. However, there's a problem. What's the problem? There's a lot of wine over there. There's a lot of wine. So there's a greater supply. And everyone's opening up another wine business. So what happened is, and now they're losing out. How are they losing out? So they're losing out. There's a lot of competition, number one. Presumably the prices are getting depressed as well because of this competition. So the situation is not good. So they got together, the wine people got together, and they wanted to make a takana. And by the way, this is another sugya, that before we spoke about how a city could make takanas for what's going to happen in their city. But in addition to that, it's actually a field, a group of people can actually make a takana for their group. And there's discussions in Gemara and Poskim about that, and obviously the concept of a union, by the way, relates to this issue. Big sugya. Anyway, so here they got together, and they wanted to make a takana and a cherem for all the wine people. That number one, you're not allowed to sell for 5. You're not allowed to sell for 5. Now currently, remember, the typical price was 5 or 4. They're like, you're not allowed to sell for 5. So wow, it sounds like these guys, they're really nice guys. They're like, Pashut, reducing the price. They could theoretically charge 5. They got together and they said, you know what? We care so much about the community that we don't want to charge 5. From now on, it's going to be less. What's it going to be less? Chatoiv larba, good wine is going to be 4. Beinani, intermediate wine is going to be shloisha, and garua is going to be lishnayim. The first time I was reading this, I was scratching my head. What's going on over here? Why would a group of wine merchants do something that's detrimental to their own interests over here? What's going on over here? Fine, you'll see in a second. The Samul Zemamunim, they hired officers. In other words, they're enforcing this now. No one's allowed to do 5, and we have another model of 4, 3, 2. Ba'amram, and they said, now the shaila is, what gives them allowed to do this? The Kehila, which preempts anything they do is preempted by the Kehila. The Kehila said they're not allowed to gather together in order to raise the price of the wine. So their answer is, we didn't raise the price of the wine. How do we wait? We didn't raise the price. We made it less. If anything, we made it. We took away the 5 and made it 4, 3, 2. So therefore, we're kosher. So what's going on over here? What are they doing? They see the market trend. The market trend is falling. So they want to protect that. So what do? Is they say, okay, 5, we gave up on 5 already because the market's been depressing. 5 was so yesterday. There's no more 5. So we might as well just pass legislation. You're not allowed to do 5. And then it looks good. We could have a front page of the newspaper is going to say, and we're going to look as good, very good PR that we're lowering the price. Really, it's a facade because already you can't charge 5 anymore because of the realities in the market. But then what we're going to do is we're going to say the price is 4, 3, and 2, and then we protect ourselves. And a year from now, it's 4, 3, and 2, even though the market itself might dictate to get less. So it's a preventive way of ensuring their better prices. But we didn't do. We didn't raise any other prices. So now, Reb Moshe ben Yamin writes to Rivash and says, I don't see a problem over here. Why? Because the only thing that was forbidden by the Takana of the Kehila was to raise the price. They didn't raise the price. If anything, they lowered the price. So therefore, it's not a problem. Now, even though, one second, but we could smell what's going on over here, that if the market trends continue, the price of wine is going to go down, and they're protecting against that. Fine, but that's not how. At the end of the day, you can't call what they are doing halal. Let's become textualists again. The legislation of the community said they can't raise the price. And what they're doing is hamada, he calls it hamada. It's stopping the market from falling. So that the community said they can't do. So they're allowed to stop the market from falling. And when he invokes here the concept of nidarim. Why does he invoke the concept of nidarim? Because when communities would make these bans, a lot of the rules and regulations of these bans are controlled by the rules and regulations of Nedarim and Shvuas. And that's because the way halacha looks at these, very often at least, is as a collective oath. That we're taking an oath, or we're taking a neder, that this is what will or won't happen in our community. And that's how it becomes binding. Just like I can make an oath that I will or won't eat a certain thing, and then it becomes binding, and I take that very seriously. That's also the communal legislation is seen through the lens of a neder and a shvua. And so therefore, you have to learn Nedarim. When you learn Nedarim, we say all the time that you follow the Lashonis, you follow the way people, if you want to know if the person is Neder, did it go on this or it went on that? So we say, but Pashtus, what language did he use? What words did he use? You look at the language. And so therefore here also we should look at the language and the intent. Language and the intent was that they shouldn't raise the prices, and so therefore they're justified. This is what Reb Moshe ben Yamin says to the Rivash. The Rivash responds as follows: Tshuva, Eini mevin ma safek yesh bekan. I don't understand why there's even a doubt over here. Varei lo yiskimu moichrei hayayin ata beineim shelo yifchas min asach asher katzvu rak shelo yimacher lachamisha. All they said right now is you shouldn't say, you're not allowed to sell 5 ela lefachos. So the point is, they didn't say that you're not allowed to do anything other than saying you're not allowed to sell for 5. But what if someone wants to sell for, take a 4 and sell it for 3, or take a 3 and sell it for 2, or take a 2 and sell it for 1? Are they allowed to? Go back to, I'm reading their takana. It didn't say they're not allowed to. It just says, the hatoiv is arba, and the beni is l'shleisha, garua is l'shnayim, and it doesn't say, but you can't go less than that. So if it doesn't say that you can't go less than that, I don't have a problem. They're allowed to meet, they're allowed to talk, they're allowed to say, by the way, this is what we should do. What they're not allowed to do is pass a rule in a way that's binding. In that, if you don't follow, then you're going to get punished. Rivash is saying that he doesn't see them doing that. He doesn't see them doing that over here. The only thing they said as a prohibition, l'saken or l'hachrim, is not 5. He's not learning the l'saken al-hachrim on that 4 needs to be 4 and that 3 needs to be 3 and 2. It's just an aspiration. It's an aspiration. You're allowed to make aspirations. That the text of the Takana of the Kehila didn't say anything against that. However, he continues, if, however, it becomes clear that that's in fact what they're doing, that you can't go less than 4, 3, and 2, so then it's a problem. What do you mean? It's a problem. What are they doing? They're not raising it. They're not raising the price. So he says the reason it's a problem is because if the yain is nimka lapachas mitzalahaba, if in the future the wine is going to end up being less than their prices, why? Because there's so much wine over there, so then it does seem like they're going on against the takana the call. Even though although right now, at the moment that they had their meeting and they said you cannot change from 4.32, it's not inconsistent with the current market. Kavanas hakol was shaloi lahales alashar haroi liyos bezulas kibutzam. Because you go by the intention. What's the intention of the community? The intention of the community was that the prices should be natural, as if they didn't collude with each other. And you're going against that. And even though at the moment that you passed your law, the prices that you set were not were not higher than the market, but ultimately that's where it's going to lead. And therefore I say that stam nadarim lahachmer. There's another rule when it comes to nadarim, that if you're not sure of this or that, you have to be machmir. So he says the only way out of this is if you have the original legislators. This is really interesting. If you have the original legislators and you interview them and you ask them, when you made the takana, what were you interested in? Was it that at the time, let's say the meeting happens on Tuesday, when you have your meeting on Tuesday and you set prices, it should not be more than the market. Is that was it? Or was it that no, it's not about the time that they have the meeting. The point is there should never be a yid who ends up paying more than the market because you met. So if they say it's the first one, then fine, you can go with the first one, and then this case is not a problem. But I don't believe it's the first one. I think it's the second one. The goal of the legislation was to ensure that when a yid, even a year after the meeting, pays, he shouldn't be paying more than the market price. This is what it seems to me about your shaila, and he concludes by writing, and have time to elaborate on my proofs, because of the needs of the shliach. This seems to mean there's a shliach who traveled to the Rivash and he needs to go back. He doesn't want to sit there for numerous days until the Rivash writes out a long tshuva with all the evidence. And so therefore the shliach is rushing, so I wrote the tshuva quickly. When you read Shalos Tshuvas, it's very common for the Rabbanim to write that they're writing Bekitzer. And sometimes they'll write that after writing 6 or 16 pages. But they're writing, I'm writing Bekitzer. And it's interesting because there's different types of excuses of why they're writing Bekitzer. Very common will be, you're a wise guy, you're a smart person, the one I'm responding to, so I don't need to be Maidach. Another is, I'm very busy. That's very common. I'm very, very busy. I'm Torah, or whatever it is. Another is, this is a simple matter. It's a simple matter. I don't need to be Maidach. Another is Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tiv or a busy season like that. That also comes up from time to time. And then there's another one that I've seen a few examples of. There's no svarim. I'm in a vacation, or I'm outside the Noida B'Yehuda is the example. I'm outside Prague and I don't have my svarim with me, so I have to be Mekatzer or whatever it is. Here you get a different one. Here you get the shliach is rushing, Pasha, so I have no time. I have to be. We have to be Mekatzer. But what do you see from here? You see from here is that in this Spanish city, the community, they were worried about the wine merchants colluding with each other to artificially raise prices above the market. And they made a takana to protect against it. Then we see the people trying to circumvent it, and then we see it turning into halachic shaila. So take these two examples. We have two cases from Spain, one from the Rashba and one from the Rivash. The community wants to regulate the price of wine. This may have been for other matters as well. Our focus today is wine. They want it to regulate the price of wine to ensure that the average Jew is not paying too much for the wine. However, so that's going to be the background. And the relevance over here is we open with the Ma'aril, and the Ma'aril is talking about an announcement that needs to be made about the wine. As we're going to see, the reason that announcement is necessary is because of other takanas that were made in the Kehillah that led to this uncertainty about actually who's selling the wine, as we're going to see. And that brings us to probably the most aggressive takana of wine sales. And if you like capitalism, you're going to have a very hard time with this. But let's read this together. So this comes from Rabbi Yuspa Shamish. We mentioned him a few weeks ago or a few months ago. He has this sefer that was published actually or printed for the first time relatively recently. It's the Minhagim of the Kehillah Kedosha of Worms. His dates are 1604 to 1678. That's when he lived. And so the Minhagim that he's writing about the Jewish Kehillah in Worms reflects that century. And on his Matzeva it says that he was the Shamish and a Sofer and the Neman HaKehillah, a communal trustee and officer in Worms for 30 years. And 2 volumes, it's printed in 2 volumes, a lot of very rich information about halacha and minig over there. And he has a whole piece about the seder of the selling of wine in the Jewish community of Worms. So let's have a read. Haminig shal mechiras hayayin kachu. Here is the custom for how the wine is sold. Parnasei akol, so the communal officers, memanim shnei anashim, they appoint 2 people, anshe chayil ne'emanim, trustworthy people. Habekiyim lahavchin ulahavdo benyayim meshubach l'shenim meshubach. They know how to differentiate between good wine and inferior wine. Vim shneiim ke'echad toivim. And if, what do you mean, the 2 wines could be good? You can have 2 good wines. Still, these guys are really good. They're going to be able to tell you amongst the great wines which one is better. I have some friends like this too, Baruch Hashem. Okay, so this is, there's a word in English, it's called an enophile, right? A person who's in love with wine. And there's some people who do this as a professional thing. It's not just as they have expertise. It looks like in the Jewish community in Worms, in the 1600s, we had people who are doing this professionally. Okay. But it's not enough that they know wine. They have to know the economy also. They have to know how much it's going to cost. How much do puadir is going to be sold for? Puadir is a fuder is the Yiddish word. It's a large barrel. A fuder somehow is related to the word a wagon, and these large barrels can only be transported on a wagon. And the editor of this book, he tells us in a footnote over there that according to his research, because weights and measures weren't like standard across the region, so they fluctuate. So he says that on the lower end, a fuder is 800 liters, and on the higher end, it's 1,800 liters. So you're talking about a significant amount. So you need to know how much this fuder is selling. And then based on that, they need to know how many small coins would cost for a mida yain. In other words, when you buy retail, a small amount of wine, you're not buying a huge barrel. So these guys, they need to know the wine, they need to know the wholesale wine economy, and they need to know the retail wine economy. Okay, we did that. And these people are nikroim weinschätzer. Right? So shots means to evaluate, right? So to appraise. So they're weinschätzers, they're wine appraisers. These officers, they send the community shamish. Maybe Rabbi Yuspa, who's known as the shamish, maybe he did this job. He would go from house to house, and through this shamish, they ask every homeowner who has wine in his cellar, do you want to sell wine? They ask him, do you want to sell wine? Anyone who says, yeah, it's not only my own, I would love to sell wine to the Jewish community here. So he used to give the shamish a small bottle of wine. Now the shamish, it's not supposed to drink the wine. So this is not such an easy job. He's not allowed to drink the wine. The shamish has to go with him down into the cellar, and he observes which chavis the wine is coming out, because we have to protect the fraud. We don't want that he took wine from one barrel, a good one, but then later he's going to say it came from another one. So we want to actually have the shamish's eye seeing where this wine came from. And in addition, he has to tell the shamish, kach v'kach machzik hachavius. This is how much the barrel it has. It has a fuder, or it has a half a fuder, so we need to know, because we're going to make a decision whether he's selling wine to the community. We don't want to go with someone who has a few sorry ounces left in his barrel. And so therefore, we need to know the volume. Then, in addition, he tells the shamish, I am happy to sell for, again, this is the standard retail amount, the midah, however big it was. We'll talk more about it soon. I'm willing to sell that for such and such amount. Okay, so he's bidding, as we're going to see. He's placing a bid to be able to have the rights to sell wine to the Jewish community in Worms. And so the shamish brings it to the place where these wine appraisers are. So they're waiting. They're like, okay, bring on the wine. And he tells the wine shetzer, and he tells, Yankel wants to sell his wine. Here it is. Oh, 1 second. Not Yankel. As we're going to see, he actually is not allowed to share the names. But he says, this wine over here is going to cost X amount. And he says, and it's coming from a barrel that has a lot, that has a little. He's not allowed to reveal who's the wine coming from. This is going to be a blind test. He brings a whole bunch of wines from everyone. And for each one, Shamish gives 2 pieces of information. How much money it's going to cost per drink, and how much does this guy have? And he does not reveal the names of the sellers. Then he adds an interesting line. He says, because till now it makes it sound like the shamish doesn't reveal the sellers, but like these wine shetzers, the vine shetzers are like dying to know. So he's like, no, and the vine shetzers themselves, they don't let him tell the names. They don't want to know. Why? Because they want to shots up the wine. They don't want to have a bias at this person or that person. Now they're going to be able to be fair about this. All right. After they bring all the wines together, now the fun begins. Now these wine shetzers, they taste the wines. I hope they're nice and give some to the shamish. After all, the shamish is the one who did all the hard work, who went around. Okay. Then they're like, this is the wine. This is the wine that's going to be for our community. So they tell the shamish, he said he's going to sell it for 5 coins thing. Go to him and tell him 2.5 coins. If he wants it, then he has the market for that amount. So they say, this is the amount, and if he agrees, then good. If not, then go to the next guy. Then we basically they have a 1, and they have a 2, and they have a 3, and they have a 4, and they decide what the price is going to be, and they wait until they get someone to agree at their price. Now what happens is that this Rabbi Yosef Shamish, years later, he actually wrote notes to this account, Hagois, he himself, in his own handwriting. And so he added the following line. He says, what happens, you could have a scenario, and I'm going to assume this happened, that of the 2 appraisers, they disagreed with each other. So then what do? They don't know which one is the best. So then they bring in a third person. They bring in, it's a zabla. They bring in a third balabais, lita mayayin, and then they go basar roiv. Okay, beautiful. The haskamas al pi haroiv. All right, then he continues and it says, once the guy agrees, so then now the shamish brings the vine shetzers to that seller, and they seal that barrel with the seal of this office of the Jewish community in Worms. He uses the words v'chosman ayaynahu be'eskasam. Eskasam is an Aramaic word that is used in Daniel Parak Vav, and it means a chosim. It means a seal. Okay, why? So that no monkey business. Okay, shelo yochal hamoicher lezayev. That is the barrel, and now this guy has the rights. But when people come, they can say, "I'd like to come to the cellar, and I want to make sure that the wine that I'm getting is actually coming from the barrel that has a communal seal." All right, and right away, the seller has to pay the tax, and they call it the umgelt. The umgelt. So is another measurement of wine. Before we mentioned the fuder. Is not as good, it's not as large as a fuder, but it's a very significant amount. According to the editor, it's between 130 and 160 liters of wine. And so somehow the tax became known as that measurement, the umgelt. Hashayach lakolo gabeit stock. In other words, we can estimate how much wine you're going to be selling, and this is what the tax is. So you need to pay in advance the entire sales tax. You basically need to pay right now. And he adds a note over there if he doesn't have the money, so he gives a mashkin. and he gives a mashkin, then we know that we're going to get, by the time is over the course of his contract, that he's going to be able to pay the sales tax to the community, and he has to pay the right amount per fuder or per whatever the measurement is. And then take if the shamish is machriz derech harachav. There's a Yuden Gasse, there's a Jewish street in Worms. And the shamish, remember, the announcements are made on the street. So the shamish goes on the street, and he goes momata lamayla, right? Chassidus likes the kata momata lamayla. So there's momata lamayla. In other words, there's the lower part of the street and the higher part. And this sefer mentions on numerous occasions the shamish's announcements, and every time it says that it was momata lamayla. This was, everyone knew that the shamish, when he makes his announcements, this is the route he takes. I'm not sure what the significance of why it had to be from the mata to the maila, but this was the announcement. And they had, look at these minhagim. They had an exact announcement that they would make, predictable. It went like this: Ploini schenkt wein die muss bekach vekach. Ploini so and so schenkt wein. Schenkt wine is the word for selling wine, is schenken. Okay, so he's selling wine, and die muss. That's that minor amount we were talking about. That's the minor amount. A regular balabas comes and says, I need wine for the next few days, and he's walking away with one bottle. So that amount is a mus. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a small amount of wine. And this is what he's selling at Pekach Vakach. And sometimes they're machers it in the shul. He doesn't say why. Why would sometimes it's raining? I don't know. He doesn't say. But the point is, sometimes it's in the shul, and sometimes this announcement is made on the street, and then what happens is, this guy has a complete control of the local wine market. No one else is allowed to sell. It's essentially a monopoly. This guy purchased the monopoly from the community, but with an understanding of what the price is going to be. So at this point, although we're dealing here with an account from the 1600s, it's fair to say that when the Maharil is writing in the 1400s, about achraza, about who's selling wine in shul, I'm not saying it's the exact same thing, but it probably is something adjacent to what we're talking about over here, where the community gives the right to a certain person to the exclusion of everyone else, and that's why an announcement needs to be made. Now, how often was this? Was it every 6 months? Was it every year? Was it every month? That I don't know. But it would seem that the Maharil is dealing with that reality, and that's why it's a shaila. Are you allowed to make that achraz on Shabbos? That's when people are in shul, and it's a new thing, and people could be living in the city for years. It's not about guests. People could be very local, but they don't know who's the guy who has the wine sale right now, and so that's why that announcement it needs to be made. Says Maharil, don't do it in shul, do it when the shamish is calling everyone to come to shul. Let's continue reading Reb Yuspa's account. He says, really, we need two people selling wine. We always have two moichrei yayin. One sells yayin yashan, and one sells yayin chadash. So one person has the market for the wine that's been aged, and the other is for the newer wine. If you were not appointed through these appraisers, you're not allowed to sell that small amount to anyone. And if you are busted, you're going to get a knas. However, if you want to sell a large amount, like the remember the we said before was between 130, 160 liters. Who's buying that amount? You're only buying that amount for like business. And no one's going to buy it. Why would you buy that locally? What are you going to do with all that wine? So it's more probably someone who wants to buy that wine to export it to another city or something like that. So if you want to do that if you want to buy big amounts, wholesale, we don't have a problem. Chatzi yom or more. So from a chatzi yom or more, you could do it, you could buy from anyone. But less than that, if it's the retail market, no. Only the wine shetzer is able to give you this permission. And then he gives it, what is this guy called? The guy who actually sells the wine is called the virt. That's what he says. All right, then he goes further and talks about more of the regulation the community has, that the kol owns the kankanim. They own these bottles. And they have shnayim. There's two different sets of bottles. Shakol ach echad machzik midachas. Each one has its own measurement. Vishnayim shakol, the community has two that holds a midah, which is that base amount, two that has a half a midah, and two that is a quarter of a midah. And basically the shamish brings to the two people selling wine, brings three cups. Here is the midah, here is the chatzi midah, here is the revius midah, and this is what you need to use. When people come to you to buy wine and you put it in their they come with their bucket or whatever it is, you need to dish it out with these three things. So we know that it's read, that the person's not getting cheated, and they know the exact amount that they're getting. So the call is giving these two sellers the call's property. It's the kehila's property, these dishes. Okay. And you have to sell your wine from those midas. And so now you come to this seller. You can, if you're a member of the Jewish community, you're coming to buy wine for Shabbos, you could be confident. Confident, number one, quality. You had the expert testing the quality. And they're looking for the best wine, number one. Number two, price. These guys, they drove a hard bargain and they got me the best price. Number three, you know that the barrel that they assessed is what you're getting because it has a seal on it. And number three, in terms of amount, you know you're not getting ripped off in terms of the amount because the guy is dishing the wine through communally approved dishes. And so in that way, you can feel very comfortable, and this fits into the theme that we're talking about. And the theme that we're talking about is the community regulating the wine trade or the wine sales in order to ensure a better result for their community. But is it a better result for the community? Is it really so clear that if you do this, prices are going to be better than if you have a complete free market? So as it turns out, at least in the next century, there were those who came and said they're not so convinced that this is the best way to do business. So we have the Takanis of Medinas Merin. Merin is Moravia. And this volume, the original Pinkas of Moravia, they would meet every few years and they make Takanis. So it's fascinating. The Pinkasim are a fascinating area. Many of them didn't survive. In fact, this one also didn't survive, but copies were made. So copies of this Pinkas has survived and were published in the 1950s, early 1950s, the Takanis. It goes from, it's 16, I don't remember exactly what year, 1650 to 1748. So it's basically 100 years of the Takanis of Moravia. And here we have a Takana from the year 1720, the year Tov Pei. It's called Vad Buchbitz, which as far as I can tell, this is the Czech city known usually as Buskovitz. So this is where the communal leaders of all of Moravia came together and they made takanas. And look what they wrote over here. 16 Rabbanim are signed on this takana. It's a long list. Here's the one that relates to wine. In those communities where there's a lot of people who sell wine, it's a mix of Hebrew and Yiddish. And they don't have any legislation. There's no rules and regulation how to dish out, how to sell the wine in those communities. So then we are saying that these communities do not have the power, they cannot introduce any legislation. It's like the federal government preempting the state and saying the state doesn't have a right to pass certain laws. It's a complicated sugya. That's what's happening here. Moravia is getting together and saying, we preempt what the local communities want to do what happened in Worms. If they don't have it on the books already, we're not going to let it happen. And they don't have, and the way it says it is like this, they can't rent out the shank. Renting out the shank is a little bit of a different model, but it basically says, we'll make you the exclusive seller in the community and you need to pay us a certain fee. So they can't do that. Oilasa is purshat. A purshat just means rules and regulations about it. That may be close to what was going on in Worms. Or they could say, we're the community is going to control the wine business. Only we could sell. We're the exclusive sellers over here. No, they can't do this. Everyone can sell wine the way they want. No one can get in the way of someone else's parnasa. So what do you have here? It's not clear, but it would seem that what is their interest? Their interest is what's better for the customer. And it would seem that they assess that what's better for the customer is just let everyone compete. Let the free market compete. Don't start playing a heavy hand in the market and trying to scale in this way. Yes, you're having the best intentions, but it's not going to give you the better result. This is a better way to get the result. If these people in Moravia truly believed that you're going to end up with better wine and better prices for the people, then why would they tell the communities they can't do it? I think that in their mind already they saw that it wasn't a slam dunk that is better. There were probably some fights and confusion or whatever it was. And so I just leave it alone, free market capitalism. Okay. This is before Adam Smith, by the way, wrote his, okay, weiter. And whoever sells wine has to pay taxes. Okay. Then he says the same thing applies to other things other than wine, but from the fact that they're talking about wine means that wine was the big issue. Then he says, Machla alav nishmahein. However, there's a flip side. What's the flip side? Vu hakehila, eze takona, or eze psak me'abedina hot bedavar zeh. This is really cool, the merging of the Yiddish and the Hebrew. Where a kehila does have an existing rule on the books, bleib takel, kefi, atakana, apsak, everything remains away. So we're not, so again, Worms is not a Moravia. So, but you can imagine, just like Worms had a takana, there were places in Moravia that may have had some takanas, and like, if you have it on the books, we're not going to tell you to repeal it. We're not going to do that. But we're not allowing new communities to get involved in this area. Now, we saw earlier that the community in Worms was very concerned about the measurements, that people get the right amount. And we're actually able to see a similar type of concern earlier in the Tkufa of the Trumas Hadeshen. Trumas Hadeshen, his name is Rabbi Yisrael Yisserlin, and he passed away in the year 1460. So he's flourishing in the 1400s in Austria. He was a Rav in Vienna Neustadt, or Neustadt, it's the way it's usually called. Wiener Neustadt. So that's where he was the rabbi. And he had a student named Rabbi Yosef. This Rabbi Yosef really loved his teacher. He loved his teacher, and after his teacher passed away, he wrote a sefer, Leket Yosher, and Leket Yosher documents everything his Rebbe did. Or I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of things that his Rebbe did, even some very, very minor things. And any story and any anhaga that he saw from his Rebbe, he wrote it. If I recall correctly, the Rebbe in the 50s mentioned that the Leket Yosher to the Trumas Hadeshen is like a chassid and a Rebbe, because the way he's super focused on what his Rebbe was doing and not doing and documenting it all is reminiscent of how Chassidim interact with their Rebbe. Anyway, so this Rabbi Yosef writes as follows. So he wrote a sefer a few years after his Rebbe passed away. He says, I remember one time the Tuvei Akol of Neustadt, that's where the Trumas Hadeshen lived, they came to the Goyin Zatzal. They came to my Rebbe. They came to Rabbi Yisrael. And they came to make good measuring kalim for the wine and the oil. And in fact, that's what they did. Why? Because the midah was nishtakach. I can't tell you I 100% understand what's happening over here, but let's try. The midah was forgotten. Why did we forget the midah? Why did we forget the good, normal way of measuring these liquids? Because the Yidden had a bigger midah from the Goyim. Why did the Yidden have a bigger one from the Goyim? Because the Yidden don't have to pay the tax that is called the umgelt. If you remember, the was a measurement, a large measurement of wine. And there too, you had umgelt was a tax. There was going to the Jewish community. Here, the umgelt is the money that non-Jewish merchants gave the local authorities in Neustadt. Jews didn't have to pay that tax. Jews had their own system. Believe me, they paid plenty of taxes, but not in this particular way. So what happened was, the Yidden were not using the midah that the Gentiles were using. Maybe it was too small or it was inconvenient, so they weren't using that midah. The non-Jews used it because that's how the taxes revolved around that. So it was legislated that you need to do it. But Jews didn't want to use it, so they didn't use it. So if they wanted to know that we go to the store and we get it and we know it's exactly 16 ounces. So you could do that for the non-Jewish measurement, because the non-Jewish measurement was around and the craftsmen were making it and always making it, and then they were testing it to ensure, because when you're making things by hand, it's not going to be consistent each one. So they had ways of ensuring that it's going to be the perfect thing, and the government was involved because they care too. So if you wanted the non-Jewish measurement, you were in good shape. But the Jews didn't want the non-Jewish measurement. That, again, not 100% clear on, but it's too small. We want something bigger. We want something bigger. Who's making it? Who's making it? How many Jewish craftsmen were there? And the Goyim had no need for the bigger one, so they weren't making it. And even if you're going to make it, how are you going to have it regulated that each one? You're going to trust the regular yankel that each one is actually going to be the right amount? So this is a problem. And now the Jewish community, use what you were using last year. Things don't last forever. And so those original midas, which presumably they came from a good place and they were good, but now they're broken and they're molding and we need new ones. Where are we getting new ones from? And how can we ensure that these new ones are going to be done to perfection? So this is the problem that they're having. So they went to a woman and she had a certain kli, a certain keli that's called a kent or a kant. And she said that this, I'm telling you, this used to be in Vienna, what everyone used, and this is a perfect midah. Okay, so they had a meeting, they're like, yeah, this is the right one. And so they sent the shamish to go to a uman who's known as a drechschler, the guy who works with wood, and they said, make me this. Make me 5 or 6 of these things. And that's what he did. And then they branded these 5 or 6 kalim with like the hechsher of the community, and they gave it to the community shamish. Now, anyone who wants to sell wine goes to the shamish. The shamish gives you that keli, and when you're finished, you give it back. So what do you see over here? Who's allowed to sell wine in Neustadt? Anyone's allowed to sell wine. Anyone's allowed to sell wine. They didn't play a heavy hand over here. But if you want to sell wine, you have to do it a specific way. And we need to make sure you're not cheating the people. So it needs to be an authorized keli that dishes it out. And it looks like there was only 5 or 6, and that was enough. In other words, there weren't more than 5 or 6 people who were actively selling the wine. And the community owned it. It was community property. That's very similar in Worms. He also said over there that it was community property. Again, that was an aspect of ensuring that the customer doesn't get ripped off. So the theme essentially is Jewish communities wanted to protect customers. They wanted to ensure they're not getting ripped off. They wanted to ensure they're getting quality wine. And that is the result of this legislation that we were talking about. And that's going to lead us now to another case. This is a little different. This has to do with Jewish, non-Jewish relations that were going on actually in Moravia in the 17th century. It's a tshuva from the Tzemach Tzedek. It's actually interesting tshuva. This tshuva is quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. What's the Maisa? The Tzemach Tzedek here we're dealing with here is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krochmal. And not to be confused with the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. Anyway, he tells us as follows, the Siman Chav Ches. The non-Jews who sold fish, there were no Jewish fishermen in Nikolsburg in the 1600s. The people who were selling the fish were non-Jews, and they raised the prices. Why did they raise the prices? Because they saw that Jews are buying fish l'chavet Shabbos, and no matter what the price is, they're coming. So like, okay, we'll raise, and they're raising. And so the community makes haskama. The Jewish community of Nikolsburg made a takana. No one is allowed to buy fish for 2 months. Now I'll buy fish. Amazing. So my Talmidim asked me, are they allowed to do it? Why? Because there's a mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos, and Kavod Shabbos is the fish. They're allowed to say not to do it? So the Tzemach Tzedek answers as follows. It brings a Mishnah in Krisos, Parak Aleph, Mishnah Zayin. Speaks about over there the problem of the price of the kinin. Kinin is a set of 2 birds. A woman who's a yeledes or a zava needs to bring that as a carbon that's part of her purification process, and she can't eat from kachim until she goes through that process, which again involves those 2 birds. And if the woman gave birth multiple times, or if she was a zava, then she needs to bring for each time. So per zava, 2 birds. So theoretically, a woman could have been a zava, never came to Yerushalayim, never took care of it, and she was a zava 16 times, so she needs to bring 16 sets of birds. And likewise, and then there's suffix. If you're a suffix, the minadin also you need to bring for the suffix. So there could be a situation where a lot of sets of birds need to be brought. One is a oila, one is a chatas. And so now it's very expensive. It costs dinarei zav. So Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, I need to put. He's a nasi. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is the nasi. He says, I need to put an end to this. So he says, Hamoin Azeh, he makes a shvua on the moin. The moin is the Beis HaMikdash. He swears in the name of the Beis HaMikdash. I will not sleep tonight until I reduce the price down to dinar and down to a much smaller denomination. So he went into the Beis and he went into the Sanhedrin and he taught. A woman who has, even if it's 5 births that are vadai, even if it's 5 zivos that are vadai, only needs to bring 1 carbon, and then she can eat kachim, no problem. And she has no responsibility to bring more birds than that. And then the price of birds fell significantly. This is what it says. Rashi deals with the obvious problem. How can he do it? How can you change the halacha? So Rashi says, yes, it is true that he was mekel. And adin, this was an emergency where we had to essentially be mavatal adin da'araisa, according to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Why? Because if we allow the economic trends to continue, what's going to happen is it's going to be completely unaffordable, and then you're not even going to bring 1. And then you're going to end up, it's going to end up being much worse. The person didn't have any element of kapara and is going to eat kachim. And so therefore, he said it's better that we should do that you only need to bring 1. Okay, obviously there's a lot of shaklavataria and discussion of the poskim, but for our purposes, what does Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krochmal say? He says, look, even over there where it's a davar da'araisa, it's da'araisa that you need to bring a pair of birds for each zava and for each birth. And nonetheless, Heikel Mishuma Yoker, he was Mekel because of the expensive price. So Kol Shekain Knias Dogim De'en El Chavet Shabbos, how much more so fish on Shabbos, which is less. And he goes into, he gives a few lines. I'll summarize what his main point over here is. Chavet Shabbos is D'oraisa. We do assume that Chavet Shabbos is D'oraisa. But the idea that you need to express your Chavet Shabbos through fish, that's not D'oraisa. Because there's other ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be. Of course, it's a nice thing to eat fish. On the Gemara, when it gives an example, it talks about fish, and if you could afford it, you should do it. And that he doesn't get into this. Kabbalah is very interested in us having fish on Shabbos for its own purposes. But at the end of the day, Kavod Shabbos is D'oraisa. The fish part is only D'Rabbanan. And so therefore he says, if we could do what Reb Shimon ben Gamliel did over there, how much more so we have a right to do it over here. Why? Because what are we afraid of? What we're afraid of is basically what's going to happen is poor people are never going to be able to buy fish. And that's a problem. And then he concludes by saying, it's mutar sheichal Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmer Shabbos harbe. The Gemara says, better violate one Shabbos so that we get many more Shabbos. This is used in halacha in various contexts. A classic case is if someone is kidnapped, so their life is not in danger, but they're going to be brought up in a home that's not observing Shabbos. So you can't invoke pikuach nefesh to get them back if they're being taken to, let's say, a monastery. So they're going to live maybe begashmi just fine over there. So the permission to go and be mechal Shabbos is under the category of mutav sheichal Shabbos achas kedei shishma Shabbos harbe. And he says this is what's similar when it comes to the concept of the fish. What do you see over here? You see the Jewish community with the same concern. It doesn't want price. Here it's not wine, here it's fish. It doesn't want the prices to be too high. Earlier, it was all within the Jewish community. Here, it's within the non-Jewish community, but ultimately the objective is the same. You see, the Rabbanim and the communal leaders want to ensure that they are going to have good prices for their community. And in this case, other cases, they were doing legislation with a knas. Here what they're doing is they're saying, we're essentially saying, what's it called in English when you say you're not going to buy something? What's it? Boycott. A boycott. There's a 2-month boycott that they're doing over here. Now, the Tshuvas of the Tzemach Tzedek were published by his son. Who's his son? Reb Aryeh Yehuda Levi was also Mamala Makoimoy in Nicholsburg. He was the Rav. And he published the Sefer, and he also added his own notes. And so this Tshuva, he added a note. What is the note? The note is, let us not forget that we spent a good month talking about hostages. So Reb Aryeh Yehuda Levi is going to bring us back into the hostage conversation. He says, there's another Gemara. The Gemara says, there's a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim. And the Chachamim said, don't do the mitzvah. So there's a mitzvah to have fish, but the Chachamim are saying don't. Why? And one of the reasons over there is it's too expensive. It's one of two reasons. Same thing here. Don't buy the fish because it's too expensive. And then he says, and in fact, there's a machlokes whether this rule pertains even if the person's going to lose their life. So assume, according to the Shitta, that even b'makam pikuach nefesh ain't poidin. So look at that. Even to save a life, we're not going to do it because of the deichak ha'ditzibura. So same thing over here with the fish. Even if you didn't have my father's reasoning that it's not mamish, that it's the rabbanon, I have another avenue. We could say that deichak ha'ditzibura means is a very serious thing, and so therefore we're not going to have to buy the fish. This is what... What was the mice at the end of the story? Well, Jews eat fish today, so I assume the embargo worked, or what do you say it's called? It's called the boycott. I assume the boycott worked. Okay, so that's in terms of the larger point. The larger takeaway from this is a small taste of something that's much bigger in halacha. You see this all over in the takonis. You see this all over in the tshuvas, the price regulation element. Here we focus mostly on wine with a little bit of fish, but it's a much broader topic as well. And because we mentioned a few times throughout the word shenken, the vine shenken, both in the Reb Yuspe Shamish in Worms, he used that term. The Shamish went around up and down the street, not up and down, sorry, up. He went Mamata Lamayla. And what did he say? Ploini shenkt vine. That was the word he used. And then we saw our friends in Buskevitz in 1720, they were also speaking about communities that have rules about vine zu schenken, and those who do have and not, and then you could rent the shenk or not rent the shenk and all of that. Okay, so I'd like to conclude therefore with the Chabad niggin that has the word shenken in the context of wine here. So here is the words of the niggin. The niggin goes like this. Vazolmen zargin. Why should you be worried? Why should we be worried? Vasatzai margin, what's going to be tomorrow? As their schenker viluns bargain. Because the schenker, the guy who's selling the wine, wants to lend to us. Lend to us means essentially he wants to sell us on credit. So like, why are you worried what's going to be tomorrow? The guy who's providing the wine is happy to say, you don't have to pay me now, you can pay me. So that's a great situation. As Magdach Zayin, it could be Brunfen oder Wein, whether it could be hard liquor or wine. Nemen Mirakele Shekarain, we imbibe a small cup of the material, whether it's Brunfen or wine. That's the first part of the niggin. And then it transitions into a pasuk in Parshas Hazinu. Harninu Goyim Amoy, that the non-Jews, the Goyim, the nations of the world, Harninu, should praise Amoy, the Jewish, Hashem's people. So the non-Jews of the world are going to be praising and singing the praises of Hashem's people. Why? Kidam avodav yikom. Because the time will have come when Hashem is going to exact revenge for the blood of avodav from Yidden. Yidden were persecuted, and when this is talking about a future time. When is Harninu Goyim Amai? In the era when Dam avodav yikom. And that's also the era when V'nakam Yashuv L'tzarav, that Hashem will take nekama on those who persecuted the Jews. V'chiper, and Hashem will appease Admasai, Eretz Yisrael, his land, and Amoy, and also the Jewish people. So that's talking about some future time, and this is the pasuk, and that's why Arninu Goyim Amei, the nations of the world, should recognize how special the Yidden are, and they should start singing the nations' praises. So what's the meaning of this niggin? So in Sefer HaNigunim, Niggin Reish Nun Beis, it says the following paragraph about this niggin. It says it's a niggin from Chassidei Chabad that come from Nevel. Nevel is in Russia. And the content of this shir is expressing hope that Hashem is going to give us. Hashem is the one who's the Shenker. Hashem is the one who's giving. And just like the Shenker is giving us, even though we don't have cash, he's fine. Credit is also good. So Hashem is also that way. And the words it uses in Sefer HaNigunim is, Limroi she'ein lanu mizumanim. Even though we don't have cash. What's the cash? Torah, avodah, mitzvahs, maisim tovim, l'shalem b'tmura. We don't have the cash. But b'chasta yisbarech, with Hashem's chesed, yitin lanu ba'akafa ba'ashroi, he's going to give it to us in credit. So that's the meaning of the first part of the song. Mikan gam hakesher ala pasuk hamavaser ala osid la v'begula shlema b'meher v'yameinu. I mean, now we can also understand the connection to the pasuk that's talking about la osid lavai. In other words, our hope is that Hashem is going to give us, and including the ultimate giving us of the Geula, even if we're not roy for the Geula. That's a shtickle, what it sounds like he's trying to say over here, and the Harninu Goyim Amai is talking about that. So two comments about this. Number one, I wonder if there's supposed to be a pasuk about the Geula. It's a very interesting pasuk to choose about a retribution from the people who persecuted us. So one wonders whether this niggin came about during a time of persecution, and when this pasuk, Harninu Goyim Amai, was particularly resonant for the people who were, and we know there was no shortage of persecution for people living in Russia and in Nevel, etc. That's comment number one, something to think about. Number two is this niggin made it to Nechoyach. When it made it to Nechoyach, they wrote in English what it says over here in Sefer HaNigunim. Same thing. Even though the English words were, even though they actually softened it a little. Because Sefer HaNigunim says, we have no cash. We have no Torah, Avodah, Mitzvahs, Ma'asim Tovim. They softened it. They wrote, even though they might be deficient. Even though they might be deficient, and we don't, so still the Eibusher is going to give. The Rebbe wasn't satisfied with that and added a word, sometimes. Even though they might be sometimes deficient. So we shouldn't think of ourselves as deficient. Maybe sometimes we're deficient. And even when we're sometimes deficient, the Eibusher shenked on. The Eibusher is giving us the brachas that we need to have, and hopefully leading to the bracha, the geula shleima.
That's a spiritual